Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Nobody from 2021. This is a movie that has come across my radar a bunch of times, and I never really had a specific reason to want to watch it nor not want to watch it. There were some things that appealed about it to me and some things that didn't. One of them is that I think Bob Odenkirk is a really good actor, and I'm always curious what roles he takes on. But also, a lot of what's presented about this movie is so generic. Not that, like, in my usual form, I try to avoid advertising, trailers, things like that. But then even down to the name of the movie is a little bit too generic to be memorable. And that's not normally something I point out that much, but this got to the point where I kept mixing this movie up with the TV show Happy, which has also been on my list for a while, to the point that I haven't watched either of them, or hadn't, because I couldn't remember which was which, and it's all kind of a blur. Media saturation is extremely high. In general, that's a whole other topic for another day. But there are some parallels, not just the, single named title, that make the connections, the sort of grittier tone, the sort of unremarkable, slightly, I don't want to say uncharismatic, but it's sort of uncharismatic main character, etc., etc., a violent past, etc., etc. So I never really got around to getting hooked into wanting to watch this, and I haven't heard anybody talk about this movie. From what I understand, it was supposed to come out, and then 2020 happened, and it didn't. So it's probably also suffered because of the release that happened delayed. But that's neither here nor there. This is a surprising gem to me, and that's even going in with reasonably high expectations. The reason I actually came back around to this movie is because I happened to stumble upon a clip. Sidebar, YouTube is a cesspool that I exist on, and is full of videos that are just blatantly not making any modification to any content and just posting whole chunks of movies. This was something that they handled, surprisingly, YouTube handled way better years ago. Meanwhile, you can't... Meanwhile, actual legitimate fair use cases are repeatedly denied. Anyway, that's total sidebar. Sorry about that. I think I was flipping through shorts, which is another horrible cesspool, thanks YouTube, and happened to catch a clip of one of the fight scenes from this film. And that is what got me to watch it. No credit given to that video itself, because some random reposter harvesting for money. But what stuck out to me immediately was the choreography and, frankly, the brutality thereof. This has a lot of style. This movie has a lot of style, and it is basically impossible to watch this in the wake of the John Wick series and not have to compare it to John Wick. And I'm going to say something, I'm going to go ahead and say this, even though I'm not 100% on it. This might be a better film than the John Wick films. That's a whole other... Have I watched one of the John Wick films on this series? I can't actually remember. But they are apples and oranges. Let's not get it twisted. But they are different things, but there are enough parallels that there's going to be a lot of direct comparisons made. To the point that the producers have been repeatedly asked if there will be a crossover, which is, don't ask producers stupid questions. That's a stupid question. Don't do that. it's hard not to compare them, but one of the main things that is different about them is that Bob Odenkirk tends to play characters who are relatively mild-mannered, relatively somewhat comedic. He's kind of a small and unintimidating guy in stature. He's kind of got a dad-like appearance. He looks like a dad. I don't know how else to describe that. He's just kind of got that like slightly worn out middle-aged man look to him, and that's not, an insult. He plays the roles he does really, really well. Compared to someone like Keanu Reeves, who has been known for playing sort of these action heroes, at least for on and off, for quite some period of time now. And so casting him in a role where he plays this very stylish, character, and has a lot of like charisma to him is such a dichotomy from this, where the whole point really is that he seems very mild-mannered. It almost goes to the point of absurdity, where the very beginning of the movie really hammers into you to a ridiculous level how much mistreatment this guy receives as a result of the people around him thinking that he's, mild-mannered, basically. I won't say anything more about those scenes because I actually think they're fairly well done. And it is a fairly pointed criticism of, I would say, modern viewpoints of performative masculinity. But really, towards the actual movie itself, it's pointing out that everybody assumes that he's incapable of doing any violence, let alone being the star of an action film. There's a couple of other things you could compare this film to as well. I'm thinking like Taken. What's that? The Equalizer. Is that the one with Denzel? I think I haven't seen it. The where he plays the hardware store. Anyway, a couple of different things, and obviously this story is not new. It wasn't new when John Wick did it. It wasn't new. It hasn't been new in a very long time. It's another story of mild-mannered guy who, under the surface, either has either or both capabilities or anger that he's not expressing, and that's we've seen actually even in this series a couple of different versions of that. You could even compare this to something like Falling Down, and this actually mixes. Well, this is both a credit and kind of an issue with the movie, is it can't entirely settle, for better or for worse, on how much of his motivation is I have these capabilities and I'm finally going to go back and use them, and how much of them are I'm frustrated with this situation and I'm finally going to use my anger and frustration and these capabilities as a secondary effect to be able to resolve these things. Overall, the plot is similarly extremely simple. It's basically it's a again a very well trodden story. It looks a little bit too much like John Wick, if we're totally honest, and it's probably the main reason for the comparison. Is minor spoilers here, but there's really nothing to spoil. That the main opponent is a like Russian coded kingpin guy, like what's the word I'm looking for? Not mafioso, but organized crime person near the top of his area. And a little bit crazy to go along with that. So unfortunately, those parallels, I think they should have, this was probably written long enough after John Wick that I think they should have differentiated that a little bit. But anyway, to get back to the actual content of the movie, there is a substantial difference between how this movie is presented and something like John Wick. I'm just going to keep comparing it to John Wick. You're going to have to forgive me for that. But I mean it in a congratulatory way, because as I said, I think this is kind of better. It's more appealing to me. John Wick is all style and no substance, if we're totally honest. And that's fine. And I actually quite like it for that. And I respect that it manages to make an incredibly impressive, flashy, well choreographed, 90 to 120 minutes every time one of those comes out. Some of them better than others. But it's all about the style and the visuals. This movie, by comparison, is not about the style. It's not about the visuals. It's not about our main character being the largely untouchable kick-ass guy who everybody's afraid of. It's kind of the opposite. He is the mild-mannered guy everybody takes for granted, and also all of the fights are scrappy. Like, he clearly knows what he's doing, but he's constantly taking a beating. And that is a difference. It's sort of a difference between, like, if John Wick is ballet, then this is more like professional wrestling. It's still very choreographed. It's still very convenient the way everybody moves, how everybody takes their pauses when they needs to, get back into the fight when they need to, so on and so forth. It's very choreographed, but it's a very different sort of less subtle, much more brutal, much more visceral choreography in this film. And I think that lends, at the very least, you couldn't swap the two, obviously. I think in no small part that lends credence to sort of the emotional state of the character and the stakes of the film. The sense of, I'm not doing this for honor. I'm like letting out my pent up rage at somebody who finally deserves it. And I think that makes it a different kind of film in terms of the audience, not necessarily the audience watching it. I think there's probably a heck of a lot of crossover, but certainly the sort of cathartic release that is associated with it, where something like John Wick is about sort of being wowed by the style of the thing. This is, I think, a little bit closer to the sort of revenge fantasy movies that are more typical of sort of the 90s and into the 2000s, many of which I've already mentioned and many of which are very bad. But this has such good choreography, it has good acting in it throughout, it has generally good writing and good production values that make it it's sort of, it's not a revival of a dead genre, but it's a revival of a genre that has been sort of languishing for a while, has not had anything fresh for quite a while, has not had anything done particularly well for a while. And so it's just a little bit refreshing to see this. This was also made for like $16 million. It's not a big, super high budget movie, but, you know, well, using money well, using the limitations of your budget, et cetera, well, I think it is worthy of credit for that. Now, I do think that there are some places where I wish it had gone a little bit more towards current expectations, and by that I'm just gonna say that for compared to something like John Wick is ultimately the prettier movie for a lot of reasons, but this has the gray-brown color grading issue. It's a little bit visually muddy in its lighting. It's the cinematography is just overall not as impressive. It has a few sort of clever shots to the point where it's almost there are a few moments that almost reach a Guy Ritchie level of style, but they are very brief. And as somebody who has sort of mixed feelings on Guy Ritchie as a whole, but think he's an incredibly stylish director. I would have liked to see a little bit more of that because, again, if there's something that Ritchie does very well, it's not only style, but that brutality as well. And so having a little bit more put into the cinematography just to give it that extra punch, no pun intended, would have been welcome. There are some scenes that I do think are done particularly well, and I don't know all the background behind the production, but the fight scenes are some of the best parts of the movie, no surprise. They're still a little rough around the edges sometimes, but generally very good. I think it also balances pretty well I don't know, Odenkirk's character, who I think his name is Hutch, is an interesting character on the surface, but unfortunately character development is a little light. This does have dramatically more character development than something like John Wick. John Wick has basically no character development. It's all exposition for the purposes of, just telling you who people are and what the stakes are. This has actual attempts to to play out a family dynamic, to play out work dynamics, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think it goes far enough on that because it either needs to do less or do more. There's nothing wrong with what it does. It's just not super compelling. And when the movie does take a not insubstantial amount of time in beats between scenes to have Hutch visit, to interact with his family, interact with his father, interact with other people who have known him before, and even the one that kind of rubs me the wrong way, there's a scene sort of right in the middle of the film that I think I can talk about without spoiling, where somebody basically, he walks into a place, he is he's judged to be not in the right place. Somebody notices something about him and immediately changes his tone. And that is never explained. It's kind of implied what the reason is, and it's even played for a little bit of comedy. But that's never really directly addressed to the point that it feels like it feels like a very obvious opportunity for narrative expansion and sort of character background that is never cashed in on, which is a shame. Because I think one of the stronger things about this movie is that with all of the, the style, the violence, and the entertainment factor of the, a revenge fantasy type of thing, it also it has the startings of a good emotionally compelling narrative in there, and unfortunately just sort of ultimately doesn't get all the way to where it needs to be for me to really be invested. So I want a little more from that. It does leave itself very open for a sequel, and it sounds like one may be in consideration. I think that would be welcome, and I would definitely check it out. I think it needs a little bit of touching up, both in the production and in the PR, certainly, to make sure that the next one gets more attention. But overall, pretty. I think that would be welcome. There is a bit of a tone problem. I'm hesitant to talk about this because I don't know how to do it without starting to spoil elements of the plot. So let me just say, I think I can cap that off there, and then I'm going to talk about something not so explicitly, but that it's kind of a tonal a plot and tone spoiler. To sort of cap this video off. So the thing that sticks out in my mind is that it can't quite decide how comedic it wants to be. It definitely injects little bits of comedy throughout the movie. Odenkirk's character is, from the very beginning, a little bit quippy, a little bit sardonic and sarcastic. He's, not taking shit from anyone, and he plays that for a little bit of humor, just because he's sort of like, it's a little bit of a direct representation of his annoyance with people. And I think that's used really well. That said, overall, most of the film takes itself pretty seriously. And there's a level of unrealism, certainly when it comes to things like the injuries and the things that are walked off, that you're not looking at this with a very realistic perspective. But it does take itself reasonably seriously and respects kind of the idea of certain stakes. That said, as it goes further along and finally culminating in the final scene, it gets cheesier and cheesier. And by that, I mean, like, it cares less and less about having a reasonable facsimile of reality and what would this character actually do and what are the consequences of their choices, etc., etc. And it goes to this final series of scenes where, full on spoilers at this point, he has used the gold bars that he saved from his work before, I guess, to dramatically overpay, I'm guessing based on the amount of gold he has, to buy his work, which he then turns into like a Home Alone style trap building to have his final showdown in, which is just so out of tone. It's already, when he's setting it up, it's already out of tone with the character we've told he is, which is like the sort of infiltrator assassin kind of guy who is like scary to know is even coming, and if you see him, you should probably just assume that you're dead. So to have him, instead of like having his final play be an incredibly impressive set of like showing of martial prowess of like hand-to-hand combat, weaponry, etc., he goes to his work, buys the whole place out so he can like basically use all the material there and mess it up and blow it up, and just for like these cheesy slapstick comedy kills, and that also detracts from the other people in the scene, including Riza and what's his name? His father is played by Doc from Back to the Future, who's a very old man now, and I actually didn't realize he was still alive. Christopher Lloyd, that's him. And they both basically only show up, like they're vaguely present prior to that, but they're suddenly extremely present in that scene, and the payoff is kind of lame because they're cheesy, and rather than it being like, oh, it's not one secret badass, it's three secret badasses. No, it's we're gonna have a silly time in a warehouse for 10 minutes, where instead of just presenting the unexpected 3-man assault, it's very cheesy. I don't dislike the scene. It just doesn't fit with the rest of the movie and the rest of what we're told about the character. And there's the ramping up of the cheesiness as it goes forward, including him like walking into the main guy's club and somehow just placing a claymore on the table and nobody notices. How he even get there in the first place, none of it makes sense. There's the cheesy things that lead up to it where you're like, that's a little weird, but we'll just brush past it because we're not taking this movie too seriously. And then the final scene to be like as ridiculous as it is, not only feels wrong, it feels like I was sort of cheated out of a better scene that could have been done. Clearly, like, people got training. There's a lot of hand-to-hand combat going on here. There's a lot of gunplay going on here. And while it's not quite as stylish as something like John Wick, like, they did the work. So I don't see any particular reason why they couldn't or shouldn't have done the less cheesy, more honest, more realistic sort of finale. I don't know. I don't really know ultimately which tone they were aiming for in the first place. So maybe that was their intention all along, was to make it a little bit lighter, but then the first part of the movie isn't light enough to lead into it. Anyway, I'll cease ranting on that before it goes too far and too long. If you end up watching the movie, which hopefully if you've seen this bit or listening to this bit, you'll have seen at this point, let me know if you feel the same way. It just feels a little odd. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.